This is Land of Fabulous, Psalm 68. It's 35 verses. Verse 1. For the chief musician, a psalm by David, a song. Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. Let them who hate him also flee before him. As smoke is driven away, so drive them away. As wax melts before the fire, so let the wicked perish at the presence of God. Comment, it's a psalm of David in verse 1. When God defeats his enemies, makes them dissipate like smoke and melt like wax, it's only a matter of time. The righteous will be glad coming up, verse 3. But let the righteous be glad. Let them rejoice before God. Yes, let them rejoice with gladness. Sing to God. Sing praises to his name. Extol him who rides on the clouds. To Yah, his name. Rejoice before him. Comment, the word Yah in verse 4 is a shortened form of God's name, Yahweh. Yah appears 47 times in the Old Testament. From Exodus to Isaiah, the full name occurs about 7,000 times. Now coming Yahweh shows his mercy and justice by doing the following. Verse 5. A father of the fatherless and a defender of the widows is God in his holy habitation. God sets the lonely in families. He brings out the prisoners with singing, but the rebellious dwell in a sun-scorched land. Comment, now speaking of the Exodus, verse 7. God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, Selah, the earth trembled, the sky also poured down rain at the presence of the God of Sinai, at the presence of God, the God of Israel. You, God, sent a plentiful rain. You confirmed your inheritance when it was weary. Your congregation lived therein. You, God, prepared your goodness for the poor. The Lord announced the word. The ones who proclaim it are a great company. Comment in verse 8, David says there was rain at Mount Sinai, but Moses didn't say anything about rain there. However, Israel camped there for 11 months, Exodus 19:1 and Numbers 10:11, and Moses said there was a pool of water there, Exodus 32:20. God made water come from a rock at 2 locations, but Sinai wasn't one of them. The only conclusion is that the water was from rainfall, that God made it rain consistently for 11 straight months at Sinai. It was a total anomaly in the weather of that ordinarily waterless place, which is why David concluded in verse 8 we just read that the sky poured down rain in the presence of God at Sinai. Let's take note of how well David knew Moses. It's easy for your narrator to search Moses electronically to refresh his memory by searching keywords like water and rain and so on, but David had to know it cold to say what he said in verse 8. God commanded that the kings of Israel should write a copy of the law of Moses for themselves and read from it all the days of their lives, Deuteronomy 17:18-19, and it seems David paid attention to that. In verse 9 of the psalm, God refreshed his inheritance, meaning he refreshed Israel with rain. Israel is God's inheritance, Deuteronomy 32:9. In verse 11 of the psalm, quote, the Lord announced the word, the ones who proclaim it are a great company, end quote. The prophets who proclaim God's word are a great many. He spoke to many, not just to Moses. Now speaking of God's power over the kings of the earth, verse 12, kings of armies flee, they flee. She who waits at home divides the plunder while you sleep among the campfires. The wings of a dove sheathed with silver, her feathers with shining gold. When the Almighty scattered kings in her, it snowed on Zalman. Comment in verse 12, kings of armies flee, and she who waits at home divides the plunder, meaning Yahweh makes the enemy run on the battlefield, and the Israelite soldiers bring the plunder home. In verse 13, the word translated campfires is a rare Hebrew word of uncertain meaning, which makes the entire verse hard to decipher, but probably God's people or his divine artwork, like the wings of a dove fashioned from silver and gold. He cares for his people and delights in them like a dove crafted in silver and gold. And in verse 14, another difficult line, when the Almighty scattered kings in her, it snowed on Zalman. Zalman is a mountain near Shechem, Judges 9:48. God scattered kings, meaning he made them run away in battle. That much is clear. And maybe the scattering of these kings, of these foreign armies, was a beautiful sight like snow on Mount Zalman. Now, following a stream of consciousness having to do with mountains, the mountains are jealous of Mount Zion because God has chosen Zion for his habitation. Verse 15. The mountains of Bashan are majestic mountains. The mountains of Bashan are rugged. Why do you look in envy, you rugged mountains, at the mountain where God chooses to reign? Yes, Yahweh will dwell there forever. Comment: the mountain of God and his sanctuary in David's time was Mount Zion and David's tabernacle. David says in verse 16 that Yahweh will dwell there forever. David knew that his tent that he constructed for Yahweh there wouldn't last forever, so why did he say that? Revelation gives more detail in chapter 21 that God will create a new heaven and earth. The new Jerusalem will descend from heaven to a great high mountain, and God will dwell there with his people for eternity. So it's all consistent with what David prophesied. Verse 17. The chariots of God are tens of thousands and thousands of thousands. The Lord is among them, from Sinai into the sanctuary. You have ascended on high. You have led away captives. You have received gifts among people, yes, among the rebellious also, that Yah God might dwell there. Comment in verse 17, the chariots of God are tens and thousands of thousands, meaning God has a massive army, which includes chariots, 2 Kings 6:17. That's why he's Yahweh of armies in so many passages, or Lord of hosts. Jesus carried on in that same vein when he said the Father could send him more than 12 legions of angels on a moment's notice, Matthew 26:53. In verse 18, God has led away captives. Of course, God brought captive Israel out of Egypt, and he leads away captives on a smaller scale as well, delivering individuals from their difficult circumstances. In verse 18, you have received gifts from the people that Yah God might dwell there. In other words, God received gifts from the people that he might dwell in Zion. This might refer to David bringing the ark to his tabernacle that he built on Mount Zion, and they offered sacrifices along the way. You have received gifts from the people that Yah God might dwell there. Coming up, God knows what we're going through. He daily bears our burdens. Verse 19. Blessed be the Lord who daily bears our burdens, even the God who is our salvation. Selah. God is to us a God of deliverance. To Yahweh the Lord belongs escape from death, but God will strike through the head of his enemies. The hairy scalp of such a one as still continues in his guiltiness. The Lord said, I'll bring you again from Bashan. I'll bring you again from the depths of the sea, that you may crush them, dipping your foot in blood, that the tongues of your dogs may have their portion from your enemies. Comment: verses 22 and 23 are a prophecy that God will gather his people, though they've been scattered to Bashan, which is a high plain, to the depths of the sea. From the heights to the depths, God will gather them. They'll crush their enemies in verse 23. The image is of God's people walking through pools of the enemy's blood on the battlefield, which will stain their feet, and their dogs will lick it off. For dogs to lick the enemy's blood off Israel's feet is an insult to the enemies on top of death. Now, speaking of the processions of God, which are people flocking to his sanctuary, verse 24, they have seen your processions, God, even the processions of my God, my King, into the sanctuary. The singers went before, the minstrels followed after, among the ladies playing with tambourines. Bless God in the congregations, even the Lord in the assembly of Israel. There's little Benjamin, their ruler, the princes of Judah, their council, the princes of Zebulun, and the princes of Naphtali. Your God has commanded your strength. Strengthen, God, that which you have done for us. Because of your temple at Jerusalem, kings shall bring presents to you. Comment in verse 27, there's a roll call of some of the tribes of Israel who are streaming to God's sanctuary, Judah, Zebulun, Naphtali, and so on. Little Benjamin was Jacob's youngest. In verse 28, a memorable line, God has commanded your strength. It's the equivalent of I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, Philippians 4:13. God has commanded your strength. He gives us strength. We access it by faith. Verse 30, rebuke the wild animal of the reeds, the multitude of the bulls with the calves of the peoples. Being humbled, may it bring bars of silver. Scatter the nations that delight in war. Comment: the NET Bible gives a plausible rendering and interpretation of verse 30 that the wild animal of the reeds is the hippopotamus, symbolizing Egypt, the same way a bear might symbolize Russia. So Rebuke the wild animal of the reeds would mean, God, please rebuke Egypt. The multitude of bulls with the calves of the peoples would symbolize other enemy nations, and the phrase, being humbled, may it bring bars of silver. If we keep to the theme of the rest of the verse, that would mean humble the nations and make them pay us tribute. In the closing 5 verses coming up, which are easy to understand, the nations will stream to God and worship Him. Verse 31. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall hurry to stretch out her hands to God. Sing to God, you kingdoms of the earth. Sing praises to the Lord. Selah. To Him who rides on the heaven of heavens, which are of old. Behold, He utters His voice, a mighty voice. Ascribe strength to God. His excellency is over Israel. His strength is in the skies. You are awesome, God, in your sanctuaries. The God of Israel gives strength and power to His people. Praise be to God. Comment Psalm 69 is next.